Good evening. Welcome to this evening's edition of TyskySour. My name's Aaron Bastani. I'm very honoured, privileged, happy to be joined by Paul Mason. How you doing, Paul?
I thought it was TyskySour. I never knew it was Tysky. I just realised it rhymes with whiskey.
It does, as in whiskey sour. Do you like whiskey sours?
No, but...
you don't? I would have thought you like whiskey sour.
No,
cocktail.
I'm a gimlet man.
What's that?
Gimlet is gin and lime juice and over ice.
Do you like a Tom Collins?
No.
How come?
Gimlet. I drink
But Tom
gimlets
Collins is
and
a gin-based cocktail.
Yeah, I like martinis.
Right.
But, only cheap ones, in case anybody's looking.
Right.
Anybody's watching this thinks that we're in some way kind of bourgeois.
I mean, they'd be correct.
Yeah.
We're going to be talking about Brexit, Trump, Bolsonaro, obviously all the big political questions of the day, geopolitical, but also ethical. We're going to be looking at your book, Clear Bright Future. It's been out now for about 6 months?
Yep.
It came out in May, didn't it?
Clear Bright Future, a radical defence of the human being. It's
Yeah.
a kind of restatement of Marxist humanism.
Yeah.
And in the age of Trump and AI
Yeah.
and fascism.
Because your last book was Post-Capitalism.
Yeah.
And obviously that's looking at technological change, economics, but this was a really radical departure, wasn't it?
Well, I think, you've written about, and you are one of the authors, I'm part of it, the Nick Cernak and Alex Williams, the kind of left that sees a path beyond capitalism that's based on technological change. But for me, the question that was always begged, and is still begged by that your writing and the writing of others, Jeremy Rifkin, for example, is who is the agent of change? And so for me, the book is a journey, that starts with me outside, in Washington on the streets with a load of black bloc people on the day of the anti-Trump riot on the inauguration day, and takes me just through, to some conclusions about what the left's politics have to be based on in order to achieve agency.
So I'll start with a simple question, I guess. You've obviously changed a fair bit, it's fair to say, over the causes, the question, and the solution to Brexit, as many people have. It was obviously an entirely abstract question that actually happened.
Yeah.
Now it's happened. Now we're 3 years into it. Now we know how it's being leveraged by certain interests, certain people with certain political values and sensibilities. What's at stake with Brexit? What happens if we do leave the European Union?
Well, I think we should do on this show, just for 10 minutes maybe, before we talk about the bigger issues, something that the media is not doing. The public service of explaining what's going on.
Right.
Because a lot of people don't get it. And I hope that, if anybody is watching this who's got a 16-year-old relative, they could show them this, record it and show them this on YouTube, because they might get the vote quite soon. In England, in Britain. So what's going on? Let me do my Newsnight style thing. Right.
We miss it.
I don't, because now I can actually say what I think. Brexit has become the project of a section of the British elite that wants more neoliberalism, more free market economics, but less globalization. Because at a certain point, multilateral obligations, like you have in Europe, commit you to a certain level of welfare, a certain level of food standards, no rat droppings in the courgettes, etc. And there's a section of the bourgeoisie, of the elite, that wants to, as I say, ditch globalization, but double down on neoliberalism. And in the book, I call that Thatcherism in one country. It was clear to me at the time of Brexit that there was a section of the elite that wanted that, but it was also clear to me that Britain has to have a semi-detached relationship from the Eurozone, and the Eurozone has to become much more integrated, and I don't really want to be part of that. I supported Remain reluctantly, like Jeremy Corbyn, maybe 6 or 7 out of 10. I would give that my strength of Remain feeling. But then what happened? Okay, that section of the elite suddenly found itself, the Conservative Party suddenly found itself the steward of Brexit. But the Conservative Party is an elite institution, and there is another dominant section of the British elite, and that is, people like Thomas Enders, who runs Airbus, people like Roland Rudd, who runs the People's Vote campaign. These are members of the liberal ruling elite. They are people with money, and they want globalization. And let's give them this: most of them want a limit to deregulation because they don't see the race to the bottom. Jacob Rees-Mogg style. Let's have Indian standards of labour rights. They don't see that as either congruent with their values, or of course who wants to start a race to the bottom, for example, in the airline industry? We've seen with Boeing where corner cutting gets you. So if you're the boss of Airbus, it's logical to say, let's keep the global system. Right, so there was a tussle inside the Tory party. Tory party is the vehicle of the elite. Suddenly there's two elites fighting each other. So I think for that reason, for the last 3 years, cutting to the chase beyond all the Theresa May bullshit and everything else, the Tory party has lacked agency. And that means the Prime Minister, the government, has lacked agency. It hasn't been able to do what it wants to do. Right, now what's just happened? Johnson has regained agency for that section of the elite that wants to screw up globalisation. On behalf of Trump, on behalf of the hedge fund guys, the private equity guys, the property speculators and the currency speculators. That's who Johnson serves. Now, how did he regain agency? How did he regain the ability to act? Obviously, first of all, by shocking everybody, by going for what looked like a no-deal strategy. Because that brings the ERG, the Tory so-called Spartans, on board in a way they haven't been. At the same time, the going for no deal, I think, was always intended to be a battering ram to get a deal. And in fact, that's what he did. So how did he get the deal? He got the deal by sacrificing one key thing, which is Northern Ireland. Since I've been in politics and since the United Kingdom has existed, conservatism has been profoundly, committed to the defence of Northern Ireland as a Protestant enclave, he just ditched it. Now, by ditching it, he achieved some freedom of movement. And as we sit here right now on a Friday night, I think he's squandered that freedom of movement. And maybe we could talk in a minute about the micro events that surround us this weekend and next week.
So do you think this Thatcherism, this genre of politics, which is Thatcherism in one country, I think it's a really good description of, clearly a fragment of the ruling class, which is represented within a fragment of the Tory party, which right now is in the ascendant. It's not just the leader, it's most of the MPs, it seems. Is it fair to say then that's quite distinct from a kind of conservatism which historically has cared about the cultural, political institutions of the country? Because you see it with Farage as well. He was asked, if Scotland leaves the Union, is that a price worth paying for Brexit? And he said, well, I don't think it'll happen, but yes.
Yeah.
And that to me is a very strange response from somebody who's, very much, for me, an identikit, sort of small business, little England Tory.
What we, historical materialists, Marxists, try and do is understand the material roots of events and phenomena in the world. Now, sometimes there aren't any. I mean, it can be as strange as that. But I think in this case, it's very clear. In addition to the fact that you've got this split among the elite, and it's true in America. One section before Trump is coming to power, one section of that elite is, the Super Bowl before Trump came to power was the one where Beyonce's standing there with all other people dressed like Black Panthers. Yeah. That's what American capitalism is supposed to look like. The next minute, it's Trump white supremacy. Yeah. So we've got this split within the elite, but this is, for Britain, there's something added. Something doom-laden, and that is, to a much greater extent than the United States, we are the centre of the world for a bunch of stateless oligarchs and crooks and crime families and dictatorships who use this country not just financially as a kind of money laundering centre, but they also use it as their playground. They also use it as a kind of plaything when it comes to politics. And so it's like, why don't they give a shit about Britain's institutions and the coherence of its civil society? Because they don't live here. What does the Saudi monarchy?
But Nigel Farage does.
Yeah. So no, you say he does, but of course he has got very strong. He did apply for a German passport not long after the Brexit event itself. But I'm thinking less about Farage is just an avatar for this bunch of people who they'll have bank accounts in Jersey, bank accounts in the Cayman Islands, their yachts. I go on holiday regularly to Greece, and with these apps that you can find out whose yacht's going past, I always marvel at I always try and work out when you see one that's got 2 helicopters and a submarine, you think, who is it? And often it's someone who has made a lot of money through speculative capitalism. And really, they don't live in countries. Yeah. Now, we as the left wing must, of course, be very, very clear not to conflate this with the age-old anti-Semitism myth of the kind of rootless elite. Okay, because Unfortunately, however, there are an elite who are very non-committed to countries, institutions, and their civil societies.
Yep.
And I think that is the added problem with Brexit. You do have, it's being pushed and chipped away at by people who've got no commitment to this country. And so, yeah, if they end up with Scotland's gone, okay, Northern Ireland is half gone. I think Northern Ireland there'll be some new constitutional settlement after 20 or 30 years of being a separate economy, which is what Johnson's deal does, if it comes to pass. England is basically London with a load of villages and a couple of decent cities outside it then. And it's a permanent Tory government because, English nationalism. I think they quite like that.
But do you not
Singapore on Thames.
Do you not think that the sort of political economic project you talked about, which clearly it converges with a certain understanding of a footloose and fancy-free capitalist class, some of it's kind of most obvious tribunes, people like Jacob Rees-Mogg, etc. They can set up, an outlet in Dublin or Paris or Stuttgart or London. There is that, but also the Brexit vote was clearly driven by an element of English nationalism. Anthony Barnett's written about this. So you'd have the exact same socio-cultural or socio-economic variables at work in Paisley or in the equivalent place in England, and you can almost infer the Remain vote. And you see this again and again. So I don't know if you saw BBC Question Time last week. There was that guy, sort of probably maybe not done A-levels, looked like he was sort of the paradigmatic Thatcher sort of voter, maybe self-employed tradesman, and he seemed to be mulling over English, mulling over in real time the idea of Irish unification, and he didn't really have any kind of loyalty to that idea of British nationalism. And I just wonder, an English nationalism itself, and this is never talked about, which is why I don't think there's a possibility of a progressive English nationalism. The people that would define as English nationalists tend to overwhelmingly hate London. They tend to overwhelmingly hate any sort of metropolitan aspect of their own.
Cosmopolitan.
Yeah.
But look,
so what kind of nationalism is it that hates the largest city within the sort of incipient nation?
Well, there's the hatred, but I'm old enough to remember actual peak caps. I know Peaky Blinders is like set in the 20s and 30s, but my actual granddad did have a peak cap. And the thing we used to take the piss out of, when we wanted to kind of stigmatise somebody who was a kind of scab or a kind of boss's narc, that gesture of kind of tugging your peak cap to your betters, is a thing that people used to do. Yes, sir. And the kind of provincial, the kind of people who leave school at 14, join the army, join the navy, become institutionalised, love Winston Churchill and the Queen. They can no longer, they don't like London culturally, but they'll look up to it. There's that kind of peak cap tugging thing going on. But let's just think about, because I don't think it's English nationalism that is driving Brexit. I think it is that elite thing, and then there's, in the book I talk a lot about, and I critique Hannah Arendt, but one of her most amazing phrases to describe fascism was the alliance of the elite and the mob, both seeking access to history in order to reverse history, even at the cost of destroying shit. Right? That's a summary of what she says. I see Brexit very much as a project like that. So, no, English nationalism, British nationalism. So I'm 59, and when I was a kid, these were the films that came out when I was a kid. Zulu, right? I mean, the horrible racist white nationalist narrative, in which the troops are Welsh. Okay, it's never meant. It's never really referred to that they're Welsh. They're British, but they sing Men of Harley. Yeah. And then Waterloo. Waterloo is a brilliant film made by Sergei Bondarchuk, Soviet, director, with thousands of Soviet Red Army extras. But who are the troops in Waterloo? The Scots Greys, the Gordon Highlanders, the Inniskilling infantry, Northern Ireland, Scotland. It never crossed my mind for a moment that Scotland was kind of a subordinate part of Britain. I just thought of it as Britain. And so, I really begged my mum to take me to Edinburgh Castle to see the Scots Greys, to all these old flags and that. I was a kind of weird militaristic kid, nerdy. But if you have had a nationalism inculcated into you that is British, it's really weird to suddenly see English nationalism come along, because there wasn't any. I really don't think there was. There might have been an implicit English nationalism in my childhood. Now, Can it be progressive? I mean, if we end up with a rump England and Wales, Scotland gone, Northern Ireland on its way to unification, we're going to have to think of something that can engage people who want to be patriotic about a primarily English state. But for me, it goes right back. People say, well, the levelers, okay, or Wat Tyler, there is something in the specific English civil society polity going back to the medieval period, in which radicalism is expressed as the birthright to be free, the free-born English person, man, John Wilkes, etc. Free-born John Lilburne. Yeah, what's the problem? What's the problem here? The levelers fought Cromwell over the first act of English imperialism in modernity, which was the invasion of Ireland. There's leveler soldiers in Burford in Oxfordshire shot against a wall in 1649 for refusing to go to Ireland to do the Drogheda massacre. So English left radicalism has always been opposed to English right-wing imperialism, and for me, this is your generation and generations beyond will have to get their heads around what does it mean to be progressive in English, and what are the sources and roots of it.
I mean, I accept this is a bit of a detour, but I think we'll talk about it. It's an important point, and also it feeds into some of the issues in the book, identity, amid the sort of dying embers of neoliberalism in the sort of early 21st century. England exists. It's clearly a geographical entity. I don't think it's going to disappear. Obviously, as socialists, we need to have a conversation about, we talk about self-government. What entity is self-governing? You can't wish away sovereignty, which a lot of the ultra-left likes to do. I get all of that. But it just strikes me that England, and this is, I read a great book recently by Alex Niven, it's coming out soon about this stuff. You think about it, English, what does it mean? Early 800s, nobody even knows what the term means. By about 1000, people know what English means. It's very much a concrete political entity, a kingdom, all the way through to the 18th century. We then get Britain. The question is, what do we do now? And I think all the manifestations we've seen of English nationalism in the last 25 years, and I think that's probably how old it is, 30 years, a lot of those are an outgrowth of what you call the neoliberal self.
Yeah.
And actually there's a really weird and bizarre and concerning convergence between outgrowths of expressions of English nationalism and that like neoliberal self. All the tat you buy with the St. George's Cross during the football matches, everything's got a St. George's Cross on it. During the poppy appeal, I don't want to have a repeat of last year, but everything has a poppy or a St. George's Cross emblazoned on it, and it's all these commodities which are having this signifier on them, rather than meaningful institutions or things that we share. Look, that's my criticism.
Even though I'm not an English, I kind of reject English nationalism. I do feel English. I don't want to be English, but as the other cosmopolitan nationalisms of the United Kingdom and the British Isles emerge, then you're almost obliged to, in some way, ask yourself about identity.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Look, I think the argument and debate I was having with Republicans in Northern Ireland last year at this Félta festival was, I took him a flag from the Scottish referendum. The three flags in the Scottish referendum were the saltire, the Scottish flag, the yes flag, which was a political gesture, and then there was a third one. And what it was a tartan flag with a picture of William Wallace, the Braveheart, two completely photoshopped Scottish lions rampant, and then kind of other weird stuff from Scottish symbolism. And when you look closely at it, it was pixelated. Some young lads had made it on Microsoft Paint, and they'd churned these flags out by the thousand. And what I noticed during the Scottish referendum is that a lot of people held yes flags, a lot of people held the saltire, but a lot of working class kind of guys who go and young women who go to EDM clubs and just get pissed with cans on the corner of the street had this flag. And it was an expression of a non-nationalist nationalism, I thought. And it was a montage of cultural symbols. And I said to comrades in the Republican movement, if you're going to be able to appeal to the Protestant working class and the middle class in Northern Ireland, you're going to need a flag like this, because you're going to need something that isn't the Irish tricolour, and it isn't the Union Jack, and isn't the red-handed Ulster. You're going to need something that people who are 20 can buy into. I think And Scotland kind of has that already. In Catalonia, I think we're seeing that as well. Although the flags are obviously very important in all these movements. But what to me they represent is a cosmopolitan nationalism that is also rooted in the neoliberal self, or rather a subversion of the neoliberal self. Because let's cut to the chase of the book. The book argues that the triple crisis we're in, economic meltdown, economic model that doesn't work, crisis of democracy, and then crisis of machine and technological control has all been opened up because we're in a crisis of the neoliberal self, the kind of person we created over the last 30 or 40 years, obeying capital, obedient servants of coercive market-based capital, can't cope with this situation. Now, it kind of, what can help it cope is if it's got an identity that is non-economic. And if you go to Catalonia, among the young people who are on the streets, or if you go to, say, West Belfast, or Finland, see, even in Finland, where there's a progressive Finnish nationalism, then far right are not very strong in any of these places. And this is the argument Sinn Féin will make, and they make it very strongly to the British left. They say you should evolve a cosmopolitan nationalism for either Britain or England, take your choice, because it's nothing to do with us. So yeah, the most successful societies at resisting this disintegration and the swing to the populist right are the ones who've got quite resilient identity-based cosmopolitan nationalisms. But that's no good, really, if you're sitting in... It's actually good for London, or for Manchester. What is the Manchester nationalism? What is the Manc nationalism? Yeah. It's able to walk from, Canal Street, where the gay area is, to, all the pubs and bars where Man City and Man United are playing, where all the kind of, very, very kind of, stereotypical kind of football lads and lasses go. And it can see it as one civil society. It can see Chinatown as one civil society. The problem if you're sitting in a small town in England, you can't see what your civil society is going to be. You can see what it was, the town I came from,
exactly
Lee.
Right, yeah.
And then what can you then see? You can see there's just no money. So it doesn't matter if you want to kind of set up a really trendy bar or a clothes shop or a kind of music-centric venue. There's just no money to pay for it. And where people who want to go to those places are going to go to Manchester, Leeds, London, Cardiff, Bristol.
Well, that's an outgrowth of contemporary globalisation, where it has this clustering effect, which basically means that you tend to get all the growth accumulating to major metropolitan areas. So that's not to say they're but they are extraordinarily wealthy. They also can have massive income inequality, deprivation, etc. But because the amount of people earning more than 80 grand a year is exponentially higher in London than it is in Stoke-on-Trent, that then means all the services they procure, all the Amazon deliveries they get, there's just more jobs, there's just more money. So that has a material basis. But like you say, it can also feed into and reproduce or reinvigorate sort of civic nationalisms at a city or municipal level. I buy that. I go to Liverpool and like you say, there's very much an organic civil society. What is it to be a Scouser? What is it to be a Manc? Just like if you go to the Northeast. And actually what I find interesting is that a lot of those senses of togetherness and belonging are at odds with Englishness, because they look at the Southeast, they look at London, they look at the stockbroker belt, they hear the accent, and they hate, I say them, they hate us, but I mean, I don't have to come from it.
I've got the accent, and I actually think it's more complex even than that, because the biggest challenge we have as the left is the fact that there's just a ton of people who live in places that have just been absolutely abandoned, and actually there is a subculture. The thing is, you can smash the working class as Thatcher did. You smash the trade unions. You people like my dad effectively were saying, if this is living, I'm not that interested in it. When I had solidarity, status, etc. You can do that, but the majority of people live. And there are people in their 60s, 70s, 80s who remember what it was like. So memory is really important. That memory and the culture that was created when those places were strong and vibrant themselves. Because remember, for 200 years, industrial capitalism made towns vibrant and cities weak. Because until neoliberalism came along, I remember pubs in central London used to shut at 9 p.m. because there was nobody in them. Whereas you go to a pub in Leigh or Manchester or Wigan, where I'm from, it was buzzing. They were locked in. Now that's flipped. But the memory remains, and their memory is strong enough to drive this absolutely justified sense of resentment. You've abandoned us, you hate us, we've got nothing culturally in common with you. What we have culturally in common with each other is without work, it's everything else we had. So it's ethnicity, it's language, it's accent, it's attitude. Where are the spaces? Where are the social spaces? For men in some northern towns, because at work you're utterly humiliated. Yeah, you're utterly the subject of capital. You're pushed around, you're shouted at. Where are the spaces? They're pubs and they're gyms, and there's the betting shop. You go on the fob tea machine. People standing around 10 people standing around the fob tea machine is a very
fixed odds betting terminal.
Yeah, fixed odds betting terminal. That theft machine.
Yeah.
If you're standing around there, 11 o'clock in the morning with your mates, it's like you see in the movies those game of craps. It's a very masculine thing to do. No, the point is that culture exists. The left is not very rooted in it, and I perfectly understand when people say you've abandoned us. The problem is what is now happening is that those communities are being recruited to a nationalist project, which can only impoverish them, and therefore the left's job, and I think Labour is doing a good job at trying to stand up in those communities. The left's job is to organise them and to never come across as literally being a metropolitan left.
Yeah.
We've got to be a left of those places, even at the price of having the stenographers of the mainstream media sit there and saying, but your position is weird, but your position is contradictory, but you're a movement of leavers and remainers. We're a movement of small town and big city working class people, and we have to remain that at all costs.
Final thing on how this relates to the English nationalism question. It just feels to me that intuitively, if you were a Geordie and you have an independent Scotland, why would you be more inclined to go to London to find work, to make a living for yourself, than to Glasgow? That to me seems like the sort of metropolis that would draw you in. Yeah. Similarly, for bits of the Northwest, Manchester, Liverpool, they feel more of an affinity to the Republic of Ireland or to Scotland than to the Southeast. So, but you think that can be surmounted, basically?
No, I don't. I think the future for if Britain goes through the Johnson scenario is hard Brexit.
Yeah.
Let's come to the downsides of it in a minute. But if he were to succeed, which I don't think he can, then you end up with a hard Brexit. You end up Ireland's half gone anyway. Scotland will go. And then, as you say, there'll be centrifugal forces, and one of the centrifugal forces will be the European Union and the strengthened Eurozone, if that happens. And in addition, Scotland will adopt the same model as Canada, which is the logical thing to do. It's a vast territory, relatively underpopulated, with large natural resources. I'm talking about Scotland.
Yep.
So what you do to grow the economy, it's not the ideal form of growth, extensive growth, which is growing the population, but it's one of the few forms of growth that are going to be left in the mid-20th century. And I see, Scottish nationalism, I think, will cohere around that. Like, it'll be a kind of Canada to the north of our. We'll be a Trumpoid America, and it'll be a Canada. So it'll say to people, from all over the world, come and build this country. We need an extra 1 million people. We've got plenty of space. We've got plenty of old stone buildings and under occupied. So what you'll then see. That's why I think if England ends up on its own, obviously Wales then has to have special privileges. It's already a principality.
Could it become an independent country, do you think?
Well, independentism is growing there. It's not nationalism, because Welsh nationalism, is not hegemonic. Labourism's hegemonic in South Wales. But also the problem is a bloody great mountain range between the north and south of the country. It's two economies attached to England. But I think England could become a bit like, Game of Thrones. It could become the Seven Kingdoms, like it was in Saxon times. Yeah. I think and because for me, I always try and make the best of things. Anyway, the post-capitalist project, I think is possible in any political, entity, but it specifically fits city regions, because in a city region, you can create a dynamic around the state, the market, and the non-market. The sharing economy, in which, because cities are natural venues for the network effect. for people meeting each other, and free stuff emerges. If we all go down here in Bermondsey to this climbing wall in the gym, business contacts will emerge, relationships will happen in a way that is much easier in a city. So, but I actually think, anyway, I still think we can defeat Brexit. So I don't know whether we can just kind of backtrack at the conversation.
Go on. Yeah, you're the boss. Go on.
No.
So we can defeat Brexit. So what does that look like? Right now, we've got Parliamentary Labour Party doesn't want a general election. Let's spend 5-10 minutes on
dissing the Parliamentary
what happened.
Labour Party.
No, what happens next with Brexit and how do you think it can be stopped?
All right.
And why should it be stopped at the end?
Johnson squandered the agency he gained by throwing away the DUP in Northern Ireland. He once he'd done that, what did he get from Europe? He got something he'd always wanted, which is a harder Brexit. So it's chucking away all the workers' rights, environmental rights, consumer standards. That's gone. That's into the never, never, never future. And he's got in the agreement a trapdoor which allows him in December 2020 to trigger a no-deal Brexit. And that's why he's been able to keep the ERG far-right Tories on board and has squashed and shrunk the Brexit Party. Farage's Brexit Party is now down in the polls. Right, but what's the problem there? On the other side of the channel, the Europeans have realised they've got a golden opportunity. Because the way I read this deal that Johnson has done is that it hands them total negotiating power once we're out. Because you've got December 2020, no deal. And everybody's going, no deal, we want no deal, we love no deal. You do not want to see no deal. It's a 10% collapse in GDP overnight. Businesses will close, people will lose their houses, people will lose their jobs. Nobody wants that. There's 5.5 million SMEs in this country. They will go bust. Self-employed people will literally go bust. Sole traders, small businesses, with a no deal. So you don't want it. And no serious section of the ruling elite wants it. No institutions, none of them. Right, so what happens? So if Johnson achieves this kind of Brexit in name only, there is then a torture rack for 15 months where Macron just tweaks the torture rack month in, month out, forcing more and more concessions from Johnson until until he just abjectly has to either no deal and the economy collapses, or they sign the deal the Europeans want. And these guys have got intelligence services, they've got the best civil servants in the world, and they just watched him in Brussels hand them the opportunity to fuck Britain.
But do you think that will happen? I mean, we had Anand Menon on a couple of nights ago, and he said no deal would be a catastrophe.
Yeah.
Very quickly, things would get very bad. But the idea that Boris Johnson's reflex would be to go, oh, sorry, the Europeans, we want a deal, let's sort this out. Couldn't that just be the beginning of something far worse?
There'll be a
the 10% collapse of GDP, then the Tories blame the Europeans, you have riots, the police come out.
Victim narrative. And incidentally,
and it could get a lot worse very quickly.
Experience on Whitehall early September, I know you have had this, and Owen Jones and other people have had it. My experience is that the British cops are not geared up to dealing with civil unrest on the scale that the far right could unleash if they feel that their entire project, which they're all wound up about, has been suddenly betrayed by, say, Boris Johnson or another Tory Prime Minister, or Jeremy Corbyn as Prime Minister. I think we really want to avoid the civil unrest scenario. I mean, when you see, what's his name, Brendan O'Neill going on, we need riots, I don't think people realise that even in the miners' strike, when there were people barricades and kind of mass unrest in mining villages, the people on both sides of the barricades basically had a shared, with the cops and the miners, had a shared kind of culture.
Yeah.
The far right in Britain with its civil war narrative might be tiny, but it's quite capable of doing outrageous things. And we need to avoid that. So how do we avoid it? I think that would be strongly in the minds of any civil servant advising Johnson, how do you avoid this? And also, how do you avoid the meltdown of your economy? So whether it's before a no-deal crisis in December 2020 or after or after it, either way, the Europeans will just dictate the terms. And I think that the ruling elite doesn't want a country in total meltdown, and I think it will it will try and do a deal on Europe's terms, and we'll end up with quite a soft Brexit after we leave. But how do we stop it? What can we do? Right, so if you're listening, anybody in the PLP, this is what you need to do. Johnson's mistake was to think that he could always put it only works for him as long as the time deadlines are on his side. So he tried to create an artificial time deadline on the withdrawal bill going through Parliament, and he failed to do it because people said, what interest do we have in this? Without the time limit, there has to be an extension. So that's his next grovelling moment when he has to actually accept the extension that's offered. We don't know what it's going to be, probably January 31st. Then what do? Labour MPs and Tory rebels and Chukwuemeka, you amend the bill. So, okay, you put customs union in, you put workers' rights in, and you take out, so these are three-point demand, you take out the no-deal trapdoor. You remove the ability.
So that can happen then?
Well, I think it can happen because...
Through an amendment. Because some people say that's the default. You can't just have an amendment for no deal. That's what they would say.
I know. What you can do is to say that... You could write into it a break-off clause that says if the parties believe that we're reaching no deal, then negotiations will you can do anything.
Right.
You can do anything, to be honest. But the three things I want to do is remove the possibility of no deal. See, because why is it there in the form it's there? Is to get the ERG on board.
Yep.
So you've removed the possibility of no deal in 2020. You put workers' rights and environmental rights and consumer rights back in, and you put the customs union on the table. Fourth thing, second referendum. Now, what do I think will happen? Second referendum, not a cat in hell's chance of passing.
No.
At this stage, because there's not enough support for it. Customs union, maybe. It was 3 votes out last time. Workers' rights, I'm told, Melanie On, Labour MP, is in and out of Downing Street talking to Boris Johnson, and he said to her, I don't give a shit about workers' rights, I'll give them to you. So I would expect workers' rights to be on the table. Not that it matters, because workers' rights will be ripped up the moment the right has one project of attacking workers' rights. The no deal thing, you'd have to find a form of words. Right, what happens then? Then it's down to Johnson and Cummings. Remember, Cummings, cast as a kind of evil genius, he's not a genius, but neither is he evil. What he wanted to do was get Brexit at any cost, in name only. And to do it, he knew you had to get the ERG on board. If they are prepared, if they can bring the DUP back, and I think Customs Union does bring them back, whatever the DUP says, no border in the Irish Sea anymore, Customs Union back, the Labour right, kind of right-wing, kind of classic, working class conservative Labour right MPs by like
Caroline Flint,
Melanie
Snell,
On,
yeah.
That's enough to get it through.
Really? I mean, the ERG's, because that's about 30 people. The ERG's not bigger than that, is it?
I think there are other people in the Labour Party who might fold. I don't want them to, but I think that's enough to get it through. And if there isn't, then you have to have a second referendum. And I know people who know Johnson well who give it 10 to 15% chance that Johnson himself would go for a second referendum, because he is, after all, this strange mixture of liberal conservative and nutcase, and posturer, and flaneur. In the end, there has to be a way out. Now, because I think the real question is, do we end up as a colony of America, with following, Trump-style ultra-neoliberal rules and taking part in Trump's war against the multilateral institutions,
Yeah.
or do we end up close to Europe, mirroring Europe's rules, mirroring Europe's cultural values? I want to do the latter. So for me, the question of whether I do it in the EU now or in a customs union or a Norway-style deal, Common Market 2.0, is important but secondary. I prefer Remain, but I'm quite happy to fall back on Common Market 2.0. And this is what separates me from the ultra-Remainers, even on the left, but certainly in the centre of the Labour Party and in British politics. Because to a lot of them, the binary question, Remain versus Leave, has become this religious, culturally defining thing. For me, it isn't, and never has been. It is. I'd be prepared to fall back to a defensible position, which is Common Market 2.0, to defeat the right, because that's the other thing. The left's going to have to get used to the idea the defence in politics is not a weak position. It's actually a strong position to defeat your enemy from.
Do you think that the Labour Party, particularly John McDonnell, these conciliatory overtures to those parts of the Labour Party, do you think that's been weakness? Do you think they've gone over the top?
Which do you mean?
So,
because there's a lot of weirdness talked about John McDonnell. One minute he's like the bête noire of the bourgeoisie. Next minute you've got left-wing websites saying he's some kind of a coup-mongering centrist.
Yeah, I don't think he's a coup-mongering centrist, but there are claims that, for instance, the overtures, both in rhetoric towards certain MPs, we don't need to name them, but people who aren't necessarily adored by the left of the membership, he's made sort of positive overtures to them, but also just his style of politics is increasingly one of defence and being accommodating. Now, some people say that's a form. It seems to be that you're insinuating that's a form of political strength. Other people would say, well, that's actually an expression of Labour's weakness right now. What do you think it is?
Well, I think it's the first thing I'll say is I'm a big supporter of John and a friend of John, and I think it's the right thing to do. I think it's nothing to do with individual politicians. What we need to do as Labour. We have had a decade plus long hemorrhage of support by traditional working class supporters in small towns, okay? And we have had a 10-month hemorrhage of support by the salariat, the more educated and skilled and urban workers who have all flipped to the Lib Dem, or not all, many of them flipped to the Lib Dems and the Greens, more than doubling the Lib Dem current poll, on whichever poll depending on what poll you look at. The Lib Dems are in a strong position. That is real. So if you take an archaeological viewpoint of it, it's like, what's the layer closest to the surface? We have to get them back. And we'll get them back because they were with us, were with the Labour movement a year ago. We get them back by showing that we are the only party that's serious about fighting the Tory Brexit. The Lib Dems are doing all this kind of posturing. And I think that what John is trying to do is to put Labour in a position where it can have that argument with that section of the electorate. At the same time, as doubling down on, and I think focusing and kind of reducing slightly in number, if not in strength, the actual number of left-wing economic policies that we're aiming to that working class, heartland, a place like Sunderland, Lee, Barnsley. And I think when you see what the manifesto might contain, I think you find that it's a very strong offer to those communities, but like it's this kind of reverse version of Blairism. Blair wasn't wrong to say, Labour needs allies to govern this country.
Yeah.
I've always said, I've been writing since 2014, Labour only works as a tribal alliance of Welsh civil society, Scottish civil society, that is including large parts of the elite, the big cities of Britain, the workforce of the big cities of Britain, and the kind of middle classes of those big cities, and small-town industrial Britain. And then it gets you to a position where you might be able to win an election if you can convince people in some swing constituencies. Used to be Essex, now I think it's the M4 corridor, and places like Canterbury or Hastings, Bournemouth. Yeah, you have to convince a kind of middle class, a true middle class there, that you represent the interest of the nation better than that's our strategy. And I think I see John pursuing it.
I agree with all of that, but often it seems to me that constituency analysis, as in social constituencies of the ones you've just outlined, I think that's almost confused with their tribunes in the Parliamentary Labour Party. So there are 50, 60, 70 people, probably more in the Parliamentary Labour Party MPs, who I don't think represent any of those constituencies. But I just think there's some bizarre hangover of like the post-politics of the 2000s.
We have the PLP we deserve, and we're still going to have the PLP we deserve after all these reselections have failed. In the end, the kind of people who hang around a lot at meetings and get selected are the people who become MPs. And until this generation of activists decides they actually want to be MPs and they're going to be able to do what it needs to be it, we're always going to have people who are not tribunes of anything, to be honest. Now, however, okay, I want to be able, or let's segment this. Let's do this. Let's be absolutely brutally frank. So one of the websites that attacks John McDonnell all the time at the moment is called Squawk Box.
And as you kindly called it Crankbox the other day on Twitter.
Yeah, I did. I thought it was quite accurate because the guy is cranky about John at the moment. Now, but it's not only John, because it's Keir Starmer. In the minds of Squawk Box and the people who follow it, Keir Starmer is a centrist. Okay, centrist. They call him centrist Keir Starmer. Keir Starmer worked for more than a decade for free for the McLibel trial. Keir Starmer, the first thing he ever did was to go down to the dockers' picket line and the miners' picket lines and defend people. He's not a centrist, okay. But
is Sadiq Khan a centrist?
Is what?
Is Sadiq Khan
yes,
a centrist?
he is.
Yeah, but he was a human rights lawyer.
Yeah, but I mean, but like not of the same kind. But let's cut to the chase. So at the point where it became obvious that belatedly Labour would swing to a position that I and others were arguing in May, which is second referendum on any deal, and oppose the Tory Brexit and stop waffling on around this unicorn deal that's never going to happen, Squawk Box ran a story which had a picture of Keir Starmer meeting Tom Watson. Right? Now, what do we think he was meeting him for? Why do we think that someone like Keir Starmer has to meet Tom Watson? I'll tell you what I think he was meeting him for. Because Tom Watson was on the point, remember, when Chuka Umunna and Luciano Berger, etc., split, Tom Watson was clearly wavering about going with them, I think. And it was being entirely in the power of that old right, kind of right-wing, Roger Godsiff, kind of John Speller type group, to leave and take another 10 people, in which case the Lib Dems are in a really strong position. So,
why are they in a strong position? Because the point is, you're talking about the social constituencies. I don't think those people actually represent or reflect a real social constituency in Britain.
I don't. But they represent constituencies at the moment that could completely screw over what we're trying to achieve. So all I'm saying is, look, the idea that whether it's John McDonnell or Keir Starmer or Diane Abbott or Emily Thornberry, that you don't reach out to try and limit the damage to your party when the elite are clearly trying to break it up by chopping lumps off it, is ridiculous. No, that's not all that's going on. A line change has taken place. I think it was too late. I fought hard for it in May. I was furious at Labour NEC for not voting it through. And if we're a live programme.
And the line changes.
The line changes. Second referendum. Yeah, on any deal, but also, what does that? It's not just any old thing. There happens to be a thing called the People's Vote campaign that puts 1 million people on the streets. And instead of sitting there saying they're all baguette waving, Waitrose customers, now you have to go on it, and you have to endure the kind of taunts. As we did, we've repeatedly done. So John and Emily and Keir have turned up on these things, and we've begun to build bridges back to that, because people say, screw the Lib Dems. They're not Lib Dems. They're ex-Labour voters from 10 months ago. So we need to get them back. Now, I think that the line change has taken place. I think Labour is capable of making a hegemonic offer. Actually, People's Vote actually barely matters now. It's what you do as you fall back you can't defend the front trench. You have to fall back into the second trench. How do you fall back? As we fall back, actually, more and more allies are available, because it's not just the ultra Remainer MPs, like say Ben Bradshaw or Stella Creasy. It's also people like Stephen Kinnock. As we fall back, I think the Labour movement will fall back towards its strengths in this struggle against Brexit. And I think that it needs to, because we need to be able to, at some point, this is the thing, at some point there needs to be an election in which you can say, either Brexit's a big thing for you on the doorstep to the voter, but we have an answer to it, which is you decide it in 6 months' time.
I think it's a strong position actually right now, given that Johnson's
if we've
failed.
lost Brexit, if Brexit has happened, this is a thing that might be controversial. In no way on earth do I want Labour to commit to we need to rejoin the European Union. What we'd say is, well now, if Brexit happens before Christmas, there's no election, but he gets his withdrawal agreement bill through by 3 votes. You go, right, well, look, we're still in. It's just we've technically left. Now, in the coming election in spring, we will put forward a very clear programme of Common Market 2.0, of a Norway-style deal, defends free movement, defends the rights of the 3 million European citizens who are here, orients Britain very decisively towards trade with and mirroring Europe. I think that would be a really strong offer. and especially if the Lib Dems go off on a tantrum of rejoining, I think it'd be an incredibly strong offer to the people who've temporarily, I hope, quit voting Labour in favour of Lib Dems and Greens. Because the one other thing I want to say is, why do you think the Europeans want to get rid of us? I think it might be a shock to some people that the Europeans were so happy that Johnson signed his deal. Macron loves Johnson now because he's going to take the Brits out of Macron's hair. Because as the Lexity has never failed to remind us, these are neoliberals. For them, in a way, as if they can smash and disintegrate this country as it inflicts wound after wound onto itself, they'll do that. Their diplomats, their trading strategists will do that as Johnson self-destructs Britain, and they will gain from it. For one thing, they'll gain all the auto industry. I'm afraid if you work in the auto industry and you support Brexit, you are voting to end your own job. BMW in Oxford, Nissan in Sunderland.
All the Japanese companies, I think, have basically said they'll be pulling out by the sounds of it.
Yeah, and we know what UKIP used to say. Tim Congdon, he used to be UKIP's, he used to be Thatcher's chief economist, but then became a UKIPper. He said to me once, look, right early on when the referendum was mooted, he said, if we get Brexit, yeah, we'll lose the auto industry, but we'll get all the kind of ship breaking and the kind of dirty chemical industry that can't exist anymore.
Who's the other one? The economist for Brexit guy. Another one. He said, oh yeah, if we leave the European Union, then one of the bonuses we won't have any manufacturing left.
Yeah.
And they openly say it. But obviously that's at odds with the argument you get from the sort of more populist Brexiteers, which is, we can reboost our manufacturing if we leave.
Johnson's famous phrase, fuck business, should have really said fuck existing business, because in their minds, there's a whole new mythological economy that will emerge, different kind of businesses. They say this. Of course, what they don't realise, it's the same as when you try and do weak Keynesianism, weak Keynesian nationalism using state intervention. What you've always got to remember is there's only a limited amount of capital in the world, a limited amount of innovation, there is a lump of labour, capital and land, in fact, it's called the planet Earth, and you're in competition for it. So just wishing to become an innovative kind of venue doesn't make you it. And it's the same for the deluded right of Johnson's brigade as it is for, say, Keynesians like Gordon Brown, Ed Balls.
Is that the difference then between the sort of far right in the 1930s and this lot? In so much as the far right in the 1930s did have a vision of how to run the economy differently, and a viable vision of running the economy differently, in a way, from Mosley to Hitler to Mussolini, in a way that, Jacob Rees-Mogg or John Redwood don't?
Well, I think we're in a worse state. I think we're in a worse position in the 1930s, because the left and the right in the 1930s basically had the same basic tools to solve capitalism's problem, which is state intervention and the suppression of rentier capitalism. As Keynes put it, the euthanasia of the rentier and the imposition of state control. As the Bernie Sanders movement never tires of pointing out, the real success of statism wasn't the New Deal. It actually was the mobilization of America for war, in which all 200 GM factories became tank factories owned by the American government. Now the left's program is inchoate. I mean, me, you, and others have tried to give a beyond Keynesian, beyond statist, anti-market, transitional program that is not widely understood, let alone accepted on the left. If you go to a trade union meeting, I went to one at the Labour Party conference last year, with Tim Roach from the GMB, Chion Wura from Labour, Francis O'Grady from TUC. I said we're facing a low work future. None of them could accept it.
Do you think they're not at all prepared for a world of automation?
What they say, and they say to you and they say
gene
to
editing
me, is there will always be new jobs. It's just myopia. And I said to them, for a party with the word Labour in as its title, you are taking a big risk not reading the research here, not believing.
Do you not think it's gotten any better in the last sort of 2 years, 3 years?
Well, people are prepared to countenance they're prepared to countenance that it will happen, but they still believe, and I'm afraid the Bernie Sanders movement believes, that the Green New Deal will create millions of jobs. I don't think it will. And I think done right, the Green New Deal automates the production of offshore wind farms, production of solar PV panels is already automated. I've been to a factory in Saxony. where they make them, can't find a worker. It was difficult to film it because it was just machines. Occasionally a German guy would pop up in a mask and look over at these glass panels.
Yeah, it's like quality control, but that's about it, isn't it?
Yeah, but so what's the relevance of this? That for the left, there needs to be a project of beyond carbon, beyond capitalism. I am an unashamed tech utopian. I believe that what will make this generation fight capitalism is the idea of a vision of what comes after it. Now, the problem we've got at the moment on the left, and it's not just in Britain, it's all over the world, is that the left is two projects. Part of it is a nostalgia project for the Benite state control. And much though I do think the society I grew up in the 1960s was a much stronger society. It can't come back because you can't degranularize. As Manuel Castells says, you can't de-electrify a country. You can't de-network a society. So our leftism has to be forward-looking. And the real problem we have is it's insofar as we look forward, we are looking. There is a bourgeois or an elite mirror of our position, just as, say, Hjalmar Schacht, who was Hitler's chief economist, was a mirror of John Maynard Keynes.
Yep.
There is a mirror of our leftism, and it is the Silicon Valley ultra-liberal Peter Thiel.
Right.
No, there's no society, there's no democracy, we have digital feudalism, everyone gets given $7,000 a year, but you have to spend it on your healthcare, your schooling, etc. Actually,
but there's not a relationship between those guys and the Tommy Robinsons and the incipient street fascism, which happened in the 30s.
No, that's true. But I think that they don't need fascism. I'm not so worried about it. They don't need fascism because they don't have that glorious, heroic generation of the 30s who fought fascism. We don't have it. I always tell this story. My granddad, who was just a miner, he wasn't leftist at all. He was a Christian, devout Christian, anti-Marxist. A black shirt got out of a car in the town I come from, and my granddad, without thinking, picked him up and threw him through a chip shop window in the 1930s. Now, why did he do that? There was no CCTV at the time, so nobody got in trouble for these kind of things. Why did he do that? Because he simply realised there was an instinctive, these guys are bad for us. We are the labour movement, their fascism decked them. Yeah. Now, because we don't have that, they don't need fascism. They can achieve what fascism achieves, the atomization of society, the elevation of the kind of little person, the little dweeby office, racist, into a kind of marching kind of machine. That's what a Trump rally is. Trump rally celebrates violence, celebrates racial, stereotyping and misogyny. Trump rallies are not far off in content what a Hitler speech during the Mein Kampf era would have been like. But they don't need the street movement. I just don't think they need it. They are going to try and use the state. And if you look at the way Johnson is beginning to use the state, if you look at the way, say, Priti Patel, Rees-Mogg, they're constantly using lies, so overt lies, ironically given lies, to blur the distinction between truth and lies. Priti Patel's off, what did she do last time she was in power? Israel, on a private trip, unsanctioned, doing her own diplomacy. They are prepared to actually erode the norms of the capitalist state in Britain to the extent that it becomes a tool for that factional interest to atomize society. So I think, the downside for us is that the elite, or the liberal part of the elite, is also very weak. I pay tribute actually to the people who formed People's Vote. Whatever you think, we're politically antipathetic to them. People like Roland Rudd, Hugo Dixon, Will Hutton, Jonathan Friedland. But I pay tribute to them for one thing: they have stuck to the defence of democracy. They understand this is just not about Remain. It's about defending democracy against this fraction, which many of them, of course, went to school with or shared apartments with in the past. This new fraction of the ruling elite that is on a dangerous path. But the problem is for them is that, as I describe in the book in some detail, that if you depoliticize economics, it's the evisceration of politics by economics. That's what Will Davis calls from Goldsmiths University. That's how he defines neoliberalism, and it's an absolutely brilliant definition. The evisceration or disenchantment of politics by economics. There is no politics in the firm. There's no politics The boss of Airbus just wants kind of an international system. He doesn't sit there going, shit, the right wing are taking over all the institutions. What am I going to do about it? The bourgeoisie's mind has been depoliticized. And this is dangerous because the popular fronts in the 1930s, and as you know, I've become Mr. Popular Front now. The popular fronts in the 1930s were made with real liberal democratic forces. Blum, the Prime Minister of France, the President of France, in 1936, was a liberal, the people who formed the Spanish government at the start of the Spanish Civil War, there were hardly any communists in it, and certainly not many leftists. There were liberals, and they were real, as it were, organic liberals who thought of it in a kind of revolutionary way against fascism.
Do you think that, say, the Liberal Democrat Party is liberal in that sense?
Well, I think despite its surge, actually, weirdly, I'd say, though I really, really critique Chukwuemeka, and it's public that I would have loved the chance to have stood against him in Westminster, but didn't get on the long list. What you can say about him is that although he's had many beliefs in his life, they've all kind of cohered around the general sort of Blairite, liberal sort of defence of democracy and globalisation. Joe Swinson, I'm not so sure. I think Joe Swinson. I think the SNP could do the entire world a favour at the next election and take Joe Swinson's 500 majority down to minus whatever, i.e. get her out of Parliament, because I think she's an opportunist. And I'm not sure what she believes actually. But you look at, say, Ed Davey. I live in a part of London that is like liberal central. So both Paddy Ashdown, late Paddy Ashdown, and Charlie Kennedy were both neighbours, and so. Yeah, Michael Oakeshot's another person. These are real liberals, and I want, in defence of democracy and in defence of in defence of stopping Brexit, I will make alliances with them. Using the long spoon that you have to use when you eat with the devil.
Yeah, I remember I did an event recently with Vince Cable, and I said, look, you proclaim to care about electoral reform, constitutional reform, getting rid of an unelected second chamber, all these things. That can only happen with a Labour government. You know that. All these things you've committed your life to politically when you were in the SDP and Labour previously and then the Liberal Democrats. And yet your leader is saying that she will never work with Jeremy Corbyn. And it showed to me the complete vacuity, actually, of modern liberalism through the vehicle of the Liberal Democrats. And it's interesting where that tendency goes. And like you say, actually, organically, I don't think it's a particularly big political constituency anymore.
Well, weirdly, there's quite a lot of liberal conservatives in that sense, but they're trapped now in a party that's been taken over by UKIP. In places like West Dorset, places like, a lot of them are in the West Country. You're looking at, people are looking aghast at what, the good old guy, the kind of guy with a jag and a kind of golf club membership, who has accepted gay marriage, accepted, a multi-ethnic workforce, has to, and accepts it willingly, actually, because they're meritocrats. They can see they want the best human beings in their firm, working, under the best conditions. They're appalled by what's happening to modern conservatism. But the Lib Dems are a weird kludge, aren't they? It's kind of a weird amalgam of like not very liberal ex-Labour people, and
anti-liberal people, actually,
anti-liberal people,
Angela Smith,
and some Tories who've just kind of ended up there, and who knows who can categorise, somebody like Amber Rudd or she's not liberal yet, but if there did become a kind of new centrist party, and we know that the ex-Blairites, that's their project, the old cadre of Blairism does want a new centre party. Its big problem is what's it going to stand for, because you need a big idea. I think we are bereft of big ideas. I think Labour is currently less than the sum of its parts because of its failure to project a big idea. But the Liberal Democrats are many, many times more less than the sum of their parts because without neoliberalism, a functioning global economic model that is kind of, you can see how it works. It becomes a kind of common sense. This is what you do. You form an outsourcing company. You bid for a government contract. You get Tony Blair to appear, in the kind of scamming emails that you put out to get these contracts as your mate, and this kind of, when that doesn't work, because neoliberalism doesn't work, it's disintegrating, it's falling apart. It's very hard to. You have to do intellectual work on what is liberalism. So I think for me, everything comes back down to the two books I've written and the one you have written and the narrative that we have both got around what is the transition beyond capitalism has to be the question that the left differentiates itself on. There has to be that. And for me, as we started out by saying, I mean, we could go through all the arguments on post-capitalism, but literally breaking up the tech monopolies, nationalising parts of them, making data into a public good, leveraging the network effect so that lots of free stuff gets produced for free, universal basic services so that education, healthcare, housing and city transport is more or less free for everybody. That, to me, is what the left needs to be about. And I am slightly sort of appalled by when you ask trade union leaders, when you ask left activists, well, what is socialism? I don't call myself a socialist, but if you say, well, you're a socialist, what is it? The idea that in a world that is where the extraction mechanism that capital uses to exploit us is primarily financial and data and no longer work, that all their answers are based on nationalising this or that monopoly and then changing the redistribution mechanisms at work. I've got to say to them, it's not enough. It's not enough to bring social justice. You won't defeat capital that way. And what's more, it doesn't solve the climate. The most pressing problem is climate. If you want to solve the climate crisis, and Labour's just produced this new, quite decent thing this week, quite decent first stage plan for decarbonising the economy. 27 million homes get refurbished, 8 million homes get heat exchange pumps, something like, thousands and thousands of offshore wind farms and onshore are created. But then what it misses out is what happens at work? What happens to work? And I like the slogan that's emerged on the German left, work less and save the planet. And until we, the Labour movement, get our heads around the fact that work less and save the planet could be the thing that unlocks political hegemony for us in this next generation, I don't think we're going to achieve that hegemony. We're going to be trying to rerun a nostalgia based on Bennism. Much though I love Tony Benn, met him many times, was part of that Ben for Deputy movement, I do not think the alternative economic strategy drawn up by the Communist Party in 1983 can solve the problems of the 21st century.